72,000 people were on their feet, clapping in perfect unison to Radio Gaga. The sound was like thunder rolling through the concrete bowl of Britain's most iconic venue. Queen was at the absolute peak of their powers, and Freddie Mercury commanded the stage like a man possessed by the music itself. His yellow military jacket caught the spotlights as he spun across the platform, his voice soaring over the massive crowd. This was supposed to be the perfect night, the kind of performance that would be replayed on television for decades to come. Then, without warning, Freddie Mercury raised his hand sharply and shouted into the microphone with an authority that stopped the entire band mid-note. "Cut the music, right now!" The stadium fell into absolute silence. Brian May's guitar went quiet. Roger Taylor's drums stopped. John Deacon's bass faded into nothing. 72,000 people stopped clapping, stopped singing, stopped breathing. In the VIP boxes, music industry executives leaned forward in confusion. In the sound booth, engineers frantically checked their equipment, thinking something had malfunctioned, but everything was working perfectly. The problem wasn't technical. The problem was human, and it was standing right at the foot of the stage. Arthur Walsh was 45 years old, and until that moment, nobody in Wembley Stadium knew his name. He was just another security guard in a black uniform, one of dozens stationed throughout the venue to maintain order and protect the performers. He stood in the narrow corridor between the front row barrier and the towering speaker stacks, his back deliberately turned to the stage. His job was simple: watch the crowd, not the show. Keep your eyes on potential problems, not on Freddie Mercury's legendary stage presence. But Arthur wasn't watching the crowd. His head was bowed, his shoulders were shaking, and tears were streaming down his face so violently that he could barely see anything at all. His hands gripped the metal barrier in front of him with such force that his knuckles had gone white. He was trying desperately to hold himself together, but grief doesn't respect dignity or professional responsibility. Grief takes what it wants when it wants it. What nobody in that stadium knew, what the 72,000 screaming fans couldn't possibly understand, was that Arthur Walsh had received the worst phone call of his life at 6 o'clock that morning. His father, Thomas Walsh, the man who had taught Arthur how to tie his shoes, how to ride a bicycle, how to be a man of honor and integrity, had died alone in a hospital bed 200 miles away in Newcastle. Arthur had tried to get the day off. He had called his supervisor at 5:30 that morning, his voice breaking as he explained that his father had just passed away. But the supervisor had been unmoved by Arthur's grief. They were short-staffed for the Queen concert. Wembley Stadium security required every available person. If Arthur didn't show up for his assigned shift, he would be fired immediately, and finding another job at 45 wasn't easy in Margaret Thatcher's Britain. So Arthur had made the impossible choice that working-class people have been forced to make throughout history. He put on his uniform, swallowed his tears, kissed his wife Margaret goodbye, and drove to London to stand guard at a rock concert while his heart was breaking into pieces. He told himself he could handle it. He told himself it was just one night. He told himself that he could grieve tomorrow, after the shift ended, after the paycheck was secured. But grief doesn't wait for convenient moments. As Freddie Mercury's voice soared through Somebody to Love, hitting notes that seemed to touch heaven itself, Arthur felt something inside him collapse. The beauty of the music, the joy radiating from 72,000 people celebrating life, while his father's body grew cold in a morgue, created a contrast so painful that Arthur couldn't contain it anymore. The wall he had built around his emotions crumbled, and the tears came like a flood he had no power to stop. Freddie Mercury was known for many things: his 4-octave vocal range, his flamboyant costumes, his ability to command massive crowds with a single gesture. But people who worked with him closely always said the same thing about Freddie that separated him from other performers. He saw people, not as a mass, not as an audience, not as statistics. He saw individual human beings, and he noticed when they were suffering. From the stage, with thousands of people screaming and lights flashing and music pounding, Freddie saw Arthur. He saw the security guard's shoulders shaking with sobs. He saw the way the man's head was bowed in the universal posture of grief. He saw someone drowning in pain while surrounded by celebration, and something inside Freddie refused to ignore it. Freddie walked to the very edge of the stage, ignoring the stage manager who was frantically signaling him to continue the show. He knelt down on the platform, bringing himself as close as possible to Arthur's level. The sequins on his yellow jacket caught the spotlights, creating a halo effect that made him look almost supernatural. "Hey!" Freddie said into his microphone, and his voice carried through the sound system like a whisper amplified into thunder. The stadium remained completely silent, every single person trying to understand what was happening. "Hey, big man, look at me." Arthur looked up slowly, almost afraid of what he would see. His vision was blurred by tears, but he could make out the face of Freddie Mercury just a few feet away, looking at him with an expression of genuine concern that had nothing to do with stage performance or rock star persona. This was just one human being seeing another human being in pain. "Why are the clouds raining on such a beautiful night?" Freddie asked gently, using the kind of poetic language that came naturally to him, even in unscripted moments. Arthur tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. He swallowed hard and forced the words out. "My father, Mr. Mercury, he passed this morning. I shouldn't be here, but they said I'd lose my job if I didn't come. I'm sorry, I can't stop it. I just can't stop crying." The confession hung in the air. 72,000 people heard it through the stadium speakers. In the expensive seats, wealthy music executives felt their throats tighten. In the general admission areas, young people who had come to party suddenly found themselves confronting mortality and loss. In the press box, journalists stopped taking notes and just watched, knowing they were witnessing something that transcended entertainment. Freddie Mercury reached down from the stage and placed his hand on Arthur's shoulder. It wasn't a brief touch, it wasn't a perfunctory gesture. He kept his hand there for a full minute, creating a moment of human connection that the entire stadium witnessed in complete silence. When Freddie finally stood up, there were tears visible on his own face, running through his stage makeup. He turned to address the crowd, and his voice carried a weight that nobody who was present that night would ever forget. "Listen to me, all of you," Freddie commanded, his voice strong but filled with emotion. "Tonight we aren't just playing for London. We aren't performing for the cameras or the critics or the record companies. There is a gentleman standing right here who is doing his job while his heart is breaking into pieces. He's protecting us, he's keeping us safe, and he's doing it on the worst day of his life because he needs to feed his family." Freddie paused, letting the weight of that reality sink into the minds of 72,000 people who had come to Wembley to escape reality for a few hours. This gentleman's father passed away this morning, and instead of being with his family, he's here with us. So tonight, this entire concert, every single song we perform from this moment forward, belongs to Arthur's father. The stadium, these lights, this music, it's all for the man who raised a son strong enough to stand tall even when he's breaking inside. He turned sharply to Brian May and gave a single decisive nod. From the top, "Give me everything you have. This one is for the man in the sky." What happened next was later described by music critics as one of the most emotionally powerful performances Queen ever delivered. They launched into Bohemian Rhapsody with an intensity that went beyond technical perfection. This wasn't about hitting the right notes or executing the complicated arrangements flawlessly. This was about channeling raw emotion into music, about transforming one man's grief into something that 72,000 people could share and help carry. For the rest of that concert, Freddie Mercury performed differently than he had at any other show on the Magic Tour. Every time he spun across the stage, every time he raised his arms to conduct the audience, every time his voice soared into those impossible high notes, he directed it all toward Arthur. He wasn't playing to the back rows of Wembley Stadium. He wasn't playing for the television cameras that were recording the performance for posterity. He was singing to heal a stranger, to let a grieving man know that his pain mattered, that his father's life mattered, that he wasn't alone. Arthur Walsh stood at his post for the remaining 2 hours of the concert, but everything had changed. The tears still came, but they felt different now. Instead of drowning in isolation while surrounded by joy, he felt held by the music, supported by the presence of 72,000 people who had been asked to share his grief and had responded with their hearts. When the final song ended and the pyrotechnics faded and the house lights began to come up, Arthur felt a hand on his arm. He turned to find one of Queen's roadies standing beside him, holding something carefully folded. "Freddie wants you to have this," the man said, his own voice thick with emotion. He placed Freddie Mercury's iconic white scarf into Arthur's hands. The silk was still warm from the stage lights, still carrying the scent of Freddie's cologne and the smoke from the pyrotechnics. "He said to tell you that your father had the best seat in the house tonight," the roadie continued. "He said that wherever your dad is now, he heard every note, and he's proud of you for being strong enough to do your job, even when it was the hardest thing you'd ever done." Arthur clutched the scarf against his chest and finally allowed himself to sob without holding back. The stadium was emptying around him. Security staff were beginning their cleanup protocols. But Arthur stood frozen in that narrow corridor between the barrier and the speakers, holding onto a piece of white silk that represented the most profound act of kindness he had ever experienced. For 23 years, Arthur Walsh kept that scarf folded in a special box in his living room in Newcastle. When people asked him why it was displayed so prominently, he would tell them the story of the night Freddie Mercury stopped a concert for him, and some people believed him. Many didn't. After all, it seemed impossible that one of the biggest rock stars in the world would halt a performance in front of 72,000 people just to comfort a security guard. But in 2009, something extraordinary happened. Arthur's son Michael was browsing YouTube videos when he came across bootleg footage from that July 12, 1986 concert. The video quality was grainy, recorded by someone in the audience on equipment that was primitive by modern standards. But there it was, clear as day. Freddie Mercury kneeling at the edge of the stage, the music stopping, the conversation with a security guard, the dedication of the remaining performance. Michael called his father immediately, his voice shaking with emotion. "Dad, I found it. I found proof. It's on YouTube. Everyone can see what Freddie did for you." Within weeks, the video had been shared thousands of times. Music journalists who specialized in Queen's history began reaching out to Arthur for interviews. Rolling Stone magazine published a feature article about the incident, calling it one of the most profound examples of empathy in rock and roll history. Arthur's story became part of Queen's official legacy, included in documentaries and academic studies about Freddie Mercury's character and the relationship between performers and their audiences. But for Arthur himself, the publicity never mattered as much as the memory of that night. In an interview with the BBC in 2010, just a year before he passed away from cancer, Arthur was asked what Freddie's gesture had meant to him. "My father was a coal miner," Arthur said, his voice still strong despite his illness. "He worked underground for 35 years, breathing in dust that eventually killed him. He never complained. He never asked for recognition. He just did his job and provided for his family. The world didn't notice people like my dad. They were invisible to the wealthy and powerful. They lived and died without fanfare." Arthur's eyes filled with tears, but he continued speaking. "When Freddie Mercury stopped that concert and dedicated it to my father, he did something that nobody had ever done before. He made my dad visible. He took a working-class man from Newcastle who nobody had ever heard of, and he made 72,000 people care about his life. He made the world stop and acknowledge that my father mattered. That one act of kindness gave me the strength to say goodbye. It helped me understand that grief shared is grief diminished." Arthur passed away in 2011, but his son Michael continued to share the story, particularly after the 2018 release of the Bohemian Rhapsody film renewed global interest in Freddie Mercury's life and legacy. Michael appeared on podcasts and YouTube channels, always bringing the white scarf with him as physical proof of his father's story. "People focus on Freddie's talent," Michael would say in these interviews. "They talk about his vocal range and his showmanship and his songwriting genius. All of that is true. But what my father taught me is that Freddie's greatest gift wasn't his voice. It was his ability to see individuals suffering in the middle of collective joy, and his refusal to ignore it even when ignoring it would have been easier." Today, Freddie Mercury's white scarf from that July 12, 1986 performance sits in the Hard Rock Cafe in London, displayed in a glass case alongside the handwritten note that Michael Walsh donated with it. The note, written by Arthur Walsh in his final weeks of life, reads, "To whoever sees this, fame and fortune mean nothing if you use them to ignore other people's pain. Freddie Mercury had everything the world could offer, but he chose to use it to comfort a stranger. That's what made him truly great. The story of Arthur Walsh and Freddie Mercury serves as a reminder that the most powerful performances aren't always the ones that fill stadiums or break records. Sometimes the most important moment in a rock star's career is the one where they step outside their role as an entertainer and simply act as a compassionate human being who refuses to let another person suffer alone. 72,000 people went to Wembley Stadium on July 12, 1986 to see Queen perform. But the concert they witnessed became something much more profound than entertainment. It became a masterclass in empathy, a demonstration of how one person's willingness to acknowledge another's pain can transform grief into something bearable. How music can serve not just as escape but as connection. How the greatest performances sometimes happen when the music stops and human kindness takes center stage.